Daily life for most Maya people revolve around family, local trade, seasonal festivals, and agricultural routine. They worship gods of rain, sun, maize, earth, death, and creation. Ritual objects filled homes, clay figurines, incense burners, grinding stones, woven mats, and simple altars. Even ordinary people believe their actions contributed to cosmic balance. Religious festivals involved music, dancing, feasting, and performance, displaying strong communal unity. Yet the same religion also demanded blood sacrifice. Workers pricked their skin, nobles offered deeper wounds, and at times, captured enemies were killed for divine balance. For centuries, this system worked. But beneath the cultural brilliance lay tension. Kings competed for territory and prestige, building monuments at a faster rate to honor ancestors and legitimize their rule. Nobles demanded resources to maintain elite lifestyles, placing greater burdens on common people. Farmers cleared more land, stressing the environment. Cities grew larger and closer together, increasing competition. Everything that made Maya civilization powerful, religion, hierarchy, expansion, population growth, architectural ambition, slowly became a source of vulnerability. By understanding this social foundation, the collapse becomes less mysterious. The system was magnificent but rigid, prosperous but demanding. Over time, stresses accumulated until the structure could no longer support its own weight. The Maya were not doomed by ignorance or primitiveness, but by the same forces that challenge societies today: inequality, resource strain, political rivalry, and environmental change. If we want to understand how the Maya civilization eventually collapsed, we must also look at their intellectual achievements, because these cultural strengths shaped their identity, worldview, and eventually their response to crisis. The Maya were one of the most scientifically advanced civilizations in the ancient world, yet their brilliance also created expectations, traditions, and systems that later became difficult to abandon. Their astronomical knowledge, for example, was so precise that they could predict solar eclipses, lunar cycles, and the movements of Venus with mathematical accuracy. Maya scribes tracked the planet Venus because they believe it influenced war timing, political change, and the fates of kings. Entire battles were scheduled according to astronomical calculations, making science and warfare deeply intertwined. The Maya created a sophisticated writing system known as hieroglyphic script, a combination of logograms and syllabic symbols. They recorded dynastic histories, religious narratives, myths, diplomacy, and daily affairs. Maya codices, folding books made from the inner bark of trees, contained astronomical tables, ritual calendars, and healing instructions. Although only a few codices survived colonial destruction, stone monuments reveal centuries of detailed history. The Maya wrote with intention. They wanted future generations to remember their rulers, wars, victories, alliances, and sacrifices. Ironically, these written records later helped archaeologists reconstruct the civilization's fall, offering clues about conflict, decline, and abandonment. The Maya number system was equally remarkable. They independently invented the concept of zero long before many parts of the world accepted it. Their vigesimal, base 20 system allowed complex calculations, including massive architectural measurements and astronomical predictions. Mathematics shaped city design. Architects aligned temples to mark solar equinoxes, solstices, and zenith events. The famous El Castillo pyramid at Chichén Itzá produces serpent-like shadows twice a year during equinox sunset, a result of mathematical precision, architectural planning, and cultural symbolism. Such achievements illustrate that the Maya did not simply build to survive, they built to communicate cosmic power. Maya philosophy connected every part of life to the universe, making their worldview both inspiring and demanding. They believed existence flowed through cycles. Death followed life, decline preceded rebirth, and destruction prepared space for creation. This cyclical thinking helped them cope with hardship, but it also meant that when signs of decline appeared, people looked to religion for solutions rather than political restructuring or environmental reform. When drought intensified or war escalated, rulers performed more rituals, built more monuments, and demanded more resources from citizens. This cultural approach was effective during good times, but destructive when crises multiplied. The Maya worldview divided the cosmos into three layers: the heavens above, the earthly realm, and the underworld called Xibalba. Rulers were positioned as mediators between these worlds, responsible for maintaining balance through rituals and sacrifices. Kings demonstrated legitimacy by spilling their own blood, often drawing thorny cords through their tongues or genitals. They believed the gods required human pain to ensure reign, fertility, and victory. These practices strengthened political unity, but also created expectations that kings must deliver supernatural results. When nature changed, when rain did not fall, crops died, or disease spread, people may have questioned royal authority. The very structure that once unified the Maya became fragile under pressure. Education among the elite was rigorous. Scribes trained for years to master writing, astronomy, and mathematics. Knowledge became a form of elite power, one not easily transferred to the lower classes. This created long-term vulnerability. Leadership, record-keeping, and scientific planning depended on a narrow group. Once dynastic systems broke apart later in history, knowledge transmission weakened, and some scientific traditions may have been lost. Maya religion and intellectual tradition also shaped their landscape. Temples rose above forests not just for prestige, but because height symbolized closeness to the gods. Cities became spiritual theaters designed to inspire awe. However, this constant architectural expansion consumed enormous materials and labor, pushing societies to cut more trees, dig more quarries, and reshape environments. These efforts helped support identity and unity, but they also drove ecological stress that, centuries later, became part of the collapse. To summarize, the Maya intellectual world was a source of extraordinary strength. It gave rise to scientific achievements, monumental architecture, detailed written history, and a cosmic worldview that connected humanity to the universe. Yet this brilliance came with hidden weaknesses, rigid belief systems, dependence on elite knowledge, and an expectation that kings could control nature. These internal pressures slowly accumulated across the centuries, waiting for the moment when external forces, drought, warfare, demographic stress, would ignite collapse. Before the Maya civilization began to crumble, it experienced one of the most extraordinary expansions in ancient human history. This period, known as the Classic Era, approximately 250 CE to 900 CE, was a time of immense population growth, architectural ambition, and cultural transformation. It was during this golden age that Maya cities reached their highest levels of power and influence. Understanding this rise is essential, because the seeds of collapse were planted during the centuries of brilliance, when prosperity encouraged growth beyond practical limits. The Maya world of the Classic Era demonstrates how success can create vulnerability, how strength can mask weaknesses, and how empires can crumble precisely because they once reached extraordinary heights. At the start of the Classic period, the Maya lowlands began filling with large, powerful city-states connected through trade and diplomacy. Cities such as Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, and Calakmul expanded rapidly. Populations swelled as agricultural techniques improved. Terracing, irrigation networks, and raised field farming allowed communities to feed tens of thousands. These agricultural successes created surpluses, and surpluses allowed specialization. With enough food, more people could become artisans, warriors, scribes, architects, and priests rather than farmers. Cities that once held a few thousand residents now held 50,000 or even more. Archaeological evidence suggests that at least 5 Maya cities reached population sizes comparable to major ancient centers in Asia and Europe. Within this growth came intense competition, political intrigue, and cultural experimentation. During this era, the Maya elite invested in monumental architecture as a way to demonstrate power. Tall temples scraped the sky, carved stele recorded royal conquests, and immense plazas provided spaces for public ritual. Each new king wanted to outshine his predecessor. Each dynasty needed to prove legitimacy. Temples grew larger, palaces expanded, and rulers added new architectural layers to older structures, physically demonstrating continuity with honored ancestors. The result was a dramatic and beautiful urban landscape that still stands today, covered by jungle vines, but undeniably powerful in design. These monuments were not built simply to impress. They were instruments of political messaging. Citizens witnessing the construction of a massive pyramid could not ignore the power of the king. Yet, such building projects came at a cost. Hundreds of thousands of limestone blocks had to be quarried, transported, and carved. Timber was required for scaffolding and plaster. Workers needed food and water, and food production needed land. Elite demands increased agricultural pressure far beyond traditional farming zones. The classic Maya did not merely exploit their environment, they reshaped it. Forests surrounding cities shrank as construction intensified. Woodlands turned to farmland and open quarries. In response, the Maya became even more dependent on complicated water systems because cutting trees altered soil stability and affected rainfall absorption. As environmental systems became fragile, cities also became vulnerable to drought, soil erosion, and famine. The classic era economy revolved around long-distance trade. Obsidian from the Mexican highlands, jade from Guatemala, cacao from tropical regions, and salt from the coast circulated through elaborate networks. Trade encouraged cultural communication between distant cities. For example, pottery styles in the southern lowlands influenced shapes and patterns in northern regions. Religious iconography spread across kingdoms, linking different Maya populations through shared beliefs. Even political alliances were forged through marriage exchanges between ruling families. Trade relationships were so successful that Maya merchants formed respected social classes. These networks, however, also created rivalry. Wealthy cities sought to monopolize trade routes, sparking warfare, espionage, and political sabotage. The classic Maya also developed governmental systems that were sophisticated and hierarchical. Kings ruled with absolute authority, supported by nobles and priests. Councils advised rulers, judges resolved disputes, and scribes recorded court decisions. Warfare expanded into a ritual theater of honor, revenge, and cosmic meaning. Victories were recorded in stone, prisoners were publicly displayed, and sacrifices legitimized conquest. Cities competed fiercely. Tikal and Calakmul became the two superpowers of the classic Maya world, constantly fighting for influence. Their struggle, recorded in hieroglyphs and burial sites, shaped centuries of politics and triggered shifting alliances among smaller cities. Religion continued to be the backbone of Maya identity. Temples and palaces were designed not only as political spaces, but as cosmic centers that represented humanity's place within the universe. The classic Maya believed that the gods actively participated in daily life. Rulers performed bloodletting rituals during coronations, and priests interpreted omens to decide when to wage war or begin planting seasons. Public ceremonies unified the population. Ordinary citizens attended festivals filled with music, incense, dance, and theatrical performance. These rituals reinforced trust between elites and commoners, strengthening social cohesion, at least during prosperous years. However, the very unity associated with religion and kingship created long-term social dependency. People looked to rulers not only for leadership, but for supernatural results. A successful king was expected to bring rain, harvest, victory, and cosmic stability. This meant periods of bad weather or disease could become political crises. Later, when droughts struck with severity, religious systems failed to satisfy increasingly desperate populations, leading to unrest and abandonment. The classic Maya rise is therefore a story of growth layered upon growth. Population, architecture, trade, knowledge, and kingship. These advancements were extraordinary, yet they pushed the civilization toward limits it did not fully recognize. As we continue the story, we will see how these triumphs slowly turned into burdens too heavy to sustain, setting the stage for conflict, fragmentation, and the first signs of collapse. As classic Maya cities expanded, their political relationships grew more complicated, shaping a world defined by shifting alliances, strategic marriages, and cycles of brutal warfare. What made Maya politics unique was not only the frequency of conflict, but the deep ritual meaning behind it. War was not simply an action to seize territory. It was a cosmic performance designed to reinforce divine kingship. Maya rulers believed the gods demanded proof of dominance, and the capture of rival nobles became one of the strongest expressions of political legitimacy. Many recorded battles show that kings sought specific high-ranking prisoners rather than mass casualties, because parading a captured enemy lord before the public proved God-given superiority. The Maya military system evolved as cities grew. Early warfare was small-scale, more symbolic than destructive. However, by the height of the classic era, wars became larger, bloodier, and more ambitious. New weapons and tactics emerged: obsidian blades, spear throwers, and organized formations. City-states built defensive walls, ramparts, and moats to protect against invasion. Archaeological excavations show entire regions fortified themselves, evidence that military threats were constant rather than occasional. Even the famous Maya ball game, often romanticized today, was tied to military and political meaning. Victories in public games symbolized strength, and sometimes captured warriors were forced to compete as part of ritual humiliation before sacrifice. Diplomacy during this period was equally complex. Royal families formed political marriages to strengthen alliances. A princess from a powerful city might marry into a rival dynasty to end conflict, secure trade routes, or produce heirs claiming multiple bloodlines. These marriages were not sentimental unions. They were political architecture. Carved stone monuments describe queens playing essential diplomatic and ritual roles, sometimes even becoming rulers themselves, which highlights the influence elite Maya women could hold. Queens were often depicted performing bloodletting rituals beside their husbands, symbolizing their participation in maintaining cosmic order. The most defining political rivalry of the classic era was the conflict between Tikal and Uxmal. These two superpowers shaped the destiny of the Maya lowlands for centuries. Their rivalry created alliances stretching across hundreds of kilometers, drawing dozens of smaller cities into a web of shifting loyalties. If Tikal supported one city-state, Uxmal would support its enemy. The result was a long history of proxy wars, political espionage, and dramatic betrayals. This rivalry is recorded in hieroglyphic inscriptions that describe ambushes, captures, coronations, and defeats. One inscription from Karakol reveals a dramatic shift in power. Tikal suffered a humiliating defeat in 562 CE, a moment known as the Tikal hiatus, which halted the city's monument building for decades. Such events reshaped the trajectory of the entire region. Trade competition further intensified conflict. Cities located near valuable resources, obsidian deposits, salt flats, jade mines, cacao-producing zones, became targets for takeover. Control of trade routes did not merely bring wealth, it brought political authority. The more a city controlled resources, the stronger its king appeared to the gods and to rival rulers. Trade goods carried symbolism as well as economic value. Jade represented life power, obsidian symbolized sacred war, and cacao seeds were used as currency. Owning these resources was like possessing spiritual credentials. As competition increased, diplomatic relationships fractured, and warfare became more common, especially after 600 CE. Welcome to History Teller YT, your go-to channel for unraveling the mysteries of the past. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating and enigmatic chapters of Mesoamerican history, the rise, life, and eventual decline of the Northern Postclassic Maya Civilization. From the grand cities of Chichén Itzá, Uxmal, Cobá, and Mayapán, to the ingenious agricultural and water systems that sustain dense urban populations, we'll explore the culture, economy, warfare, migration, art, intellectual traditions, and spiritual life of the Maya after the collapse of their southern lowland cities. We'll travel through time to uncover how environmental challenges, demographic shifts, trade networks, military strategy, and ritual practices all shaped these remarkable urban centers. You'll discover the brilliance of Maya architecture, the precision of their astronomical and mathematical knowledge, and the resilience of their society in the face of droughts, political upheaval, and migration. By the end of this story, you'll not only understand how these cities thrived and ultimately declined, but also how their legacy, intellectual, artistic, and cultural, continues to influence the Maya world today. So, sit back, relax, and let History Teller YT take you on a journey through the epic saga of the Northern Postclassic Maya Civilization. Before the fall of the Maya Civilization, before the collapse, before the abandoned cities, before the forests reclaimed temples, the Maya world flourished for thousands of years in what is now southern Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. To understand how this great civilization fell, we must first understand how astonishingly advanced it once was. The Maya built an intellectual and cultural empire driven by astronomy, architecture, mathematics, agriculture, and religion. They did not simply survive in the rainforest. They thrived within it, turning difficult jungle terrain into organized kingdoms connected by trade routes, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Their cities were not small settlements hidden under trees. They were enormous urban centers like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, and Copan, filled with plazas, pyramids, ball courts, palaces, and observatories. The Maya created one of the most accurate calendars in human history, calculated solar movements with astonishing precision, and produced a writing system capable of recording history, poetry, mathematics, and political events long before many European societies had similar achievements. Elites ruled from towering temples, priests interpreted the cosmos, and farmers fed the population with maize, beans, squash, and cacao. Their trade networks stretched across dense jungles, mountains, and coastlines. Salt, obsidian, jade, feathers, shells, and food moved across vast distances, linking Maya kingdoms into a cultural web. These networks allowed ideas to spread. Art styles evolved, languages blended, and religious beliefs unified people from distant regions. Life in Maya cities was ruled by ritual and cosmic meaning. Every building, every statue, and even city layout reflected astronomical alignment. Temples stood at angles designed to mark solstices, equinoxes, and star cycles. To Maya minds, the universe was alive. Gods controlled rain, crops, war, and fate itself. Human kings were believed to communicate with these divine forces, performing bloodletting rituals to legitimize their right to rule. But beneath this shining world, pressure slowly built. Urban centers began to grow larger than their food systems could support. Drought cycles increased. Minor power struggles escalated into full-scale wars between rival dynasties. Overpopulation strained a rainforest environment to the breaking point. As rulers demanded more construction, more sacrifice, and more labor, resentment simmered. At first glance, the story of the Maya is a mystery of disappearance. But the truth begins long before the collapse. Their decline makes sense only when we understand how magnificent, complex, and interconnected their world had become. A society this powerful does not crumble from a single cause. It unravels through a combination of environmental stress, warfare, overexpansion, and shifting belief structures. The Maya fall cannot be separated from the Maya rise, because the seeds of collapse were planted during their golden age. This opening segment sets the foundation. The Maya civilization was not primitive, not isolated, and not destined to fall from the beginning. It was a place of brilliance, ambition, and resilience, a world too powerful to vanish without leaving behind questions that still haunt archaeology today. To grasp why the Maya civilization eventually collapsed, we must examine the social structure that held their world together and ultimately contributed to its fragmentation. Maya society was organized in complex layers, shaped by class, belief, and inherited status. At the top sat divine kings, called Kuhulajaw, rulers believed to be the earthly representatives of sacred gods. Their words were not merely political orders. They were cosmic declarations. When a Maya king commanded a city to build, fight, sacrifice, or worship, people obeyed because the command came wrapped in supernatural authority. This powerful belief system forged loyalty for centuries, allowing kings to mobilize thousands of workers to construct pyramids, reservoirs, palaces, and entire city districts without modern tools or animals to pull stone. Beneath the rulers existed a noble class of priests, astronomers, scribes, architects, and elite families who acted as political managers and economic organizers. They administered taxes, often in the form of food, labor, and crafts. They also directed ceremonial events, reading the movements of stars to determine planting cycles and war dates. The Maya calendar system required careful observation, mathematical knowledge, and generational memory, skills held by a limited elite who guarded their information from common people. This monopoly on knowledge ensured elite power, but it also made the civilization vulnerable. When cities later fractured and knowledge keepers vanished, crucial information risked being lost forever. Below the nobles existed skilled craftsmen, potters, stone workers, painters, weavers, and architects, whose artistry remains stunning today. Maya pottery depicts dynasties, myths, wars, and rituals with astonishing detail. Murals show everyday life, costumes, feasts, court gatherings, and ballgame scenes. Jade masks and obsidian blades reveal intricate trade connections. These artistic achievements show that Maya culture was not static. It evolved, innovated, and expressed identity through material beauty. But maintaining such elaborate culture demanded enormous economic energy. The largest population group consisted of farmers who worked day and night to feed growing urban centers. They produced vast quantities of maize, the sacred heart of Maya diet and mythology. According to Maya belief, humans themselves were created from maize dough, a symbol that reflected both identity and dependence. As populations increased, farmers had to expand agriculture deeper into forests, carve terraces into hillsides, and drain swamps for farmland. These efforts supported millions, but they also pushed the land toward exhaustion. Soil quality gradually weakened, requiring more labor for fewer crops. Meanwhile, rainfall patterns, previously dependable, began to shift. Art production likewise showed ideological fatigue. Royal portraiture shrank in quality and quantity. Decorative stucco grew thinner. Colors faded. Some workshops closed entirely. Trade networks supplying pigments and exotic materials collapsed or shifted elsewhere. Artistic decline did not mean loss of talent. It meant loss of stability. Artists require food, shelter, patrons, and peaceful conditions. Without those, artistic output becomes impossible. Urban infrastructure also began showing stress fractures. Roads fell into disrepair, canals clogged with sediment, and once carefully maintained terraces eroded. Kings who once commanded thousands of laborers could no longer mobilize enough people to repair old structures, much less build new ones. Cities that had once glittered with fresh plaster fell into cracked stone silence. Yet perhaps the most human of all warning signs is psychological. Hope began to fade. When multiple generations witnessed drought, hunger, defeat, and mortality, belief in recovery diminishes. People look elsewhere for opportunity. They migrate, change allegiance, abandon faith, or break tradition. The Maya collapse was not just a structural failure. It was an emotional one. By the end of these early warning centuries, the Maya world had transformed from confident expansion to cultural uncertainty. Everything that once seemed permanent now appeared fragile. The next phases of history would not bring relief. They would bring unraveling. Environmental catastrophe stands at the heart of the Maya collapse narrative, and one of the most defining forces was the arrival of intense climate change across the Maya lowlands. After centuries of stability, the region began experiencing prolonged dry periods that scholars now call the Great Maya Droughts. These events unfolded over decades. Not single bad seasons, but entire cycles of crippling rainfall shortages that transformed cities, landscapes, and belief systems. Maya culture depended on regular seasonal rain. Without it, their agricultural system struggled. The classic Maya world had never before faced drought conditions on this scale, and the early stages of these climatic disruptions became one of the most devastating pressures on the civilization's foundations. At the height of classic Maya power, the environment was already overstressed by population growth and deforestation. Farmers had cleared vast tracts of jungle to feed millions of people. With fewer trees, rainfall absorption weakened dramatically. Dense forests once acted like sponges, releasing moisture into the atmosphere, stabilizing temperatures and protecting soil. But as forests were cleared to make way for maize fields, soil formed loose dust that washed away easily during tropical storms. Or worse, cracked dry during droughts. Because the Maya relied heavily on rain-fed agriculture rather than running rivers or mountain snowmelt, the sudden decline in rainfall pushed communities into crisis faster than many civilizations elsewhere might have experienced. Early drought cycles in the 7th century triggered signs of stress. Lake cores taken from the Yucatan Peninsula show drops in water levels that correspond directly with archaeological evidence of political unrest. These lakebed records contain microscopic fossils and chemical signatures revealing long dry intervals. Meanwhile, ancient plaster from Maya buildings locked in oxygen isotopes that preserve moisture levels from their time of construction. Scientists analyzing these plaster layers discovered that temples built during the late Classic era were made during increasingly dry years. What once seemed like myth or vague memory has become scientific proof. The Maya world was drying out dramatically across multiple generations. Water scarcity changed daily life. Reservoirs that once provided drinking water for thousands dried into cracked clay pits. Ponds shrank into muddy basins. Rivers that once supported trade routes narrowed so severely that canoe travel became impossible. In some areas, people dug deep shafts and limestone wells to reach groundwater. These underground water systems required careful maintenance, team effort, and strong political organization. While some cities succeeded in securing access to these resources, others lacked the infrastructure or manpower to adapt. Without water, crops withered, livestock died, and disease spread. Drought also created intense economic pressure. Agricultural surpluses had allowed elites to host large feasts, sponsor monumental building, and maintain armies. Without surplus, kings could no longer reward loyalty through food and festivals. Nobles lost their social leverage. Peasants could no longer afford to supply tribute. The entire tribute economy weakened, striking at the heart of the political system. Ritual calendars became unreliable because they predicted harvest cycles based on traditions shaped during wetter centuries. When prediction failed, faith in cosmic order faltered. Spiritual responses to drought became increasingly dramatic. Kings and priests performed bloodletting ceremonies hoping to restore rainfall through divine negotiation. Captured prisoners were sacrificed atop temple pyramids, their blood offered to gods associated with rain and maize. Entire cities held massive ritual gatherings, sometimes involving thousands of worshippers chanting for celestial mercy. Yet the rain did not return consistently. Instead, drought cycles repeated, becoming longer and more severe. Inscriptions show kings publicly justifying their rule by declaring divine resilience against natural threat. But as the drought deepened, that justification wore thin. Water scarcity changed daily life. Reservoirs that once provided drinking water for thousands dried into cracked clay pits. Ponds shrank into muddy basins. Rivers that once supported trade routes narrowed so severely that canoe travel became impossible. In some areas, people dug deep shafts and limestone wells to reach groundwater. These underground water systems required careful maintenance, team effort, and strong political organization. While some cities succeeded in securing access to these resources, others lacked the infrastructure or manpower to adapt. Without water, crops withered, livestock died, and disease spread. Drought also created intense economic pressure. Agricultural surpluses had allowed elites to host large feasts, sponsor monumental building, and maintain armies. Without surplus, kings could no longer reward loyalty through food and festivals. Nobles lost their social leverage. Peasants could no longer afford to supply tribute. The entire tribute economy weakened, striking at the heart of the political system. Ritual calendars became unreliable because they predicted harvest cycles based on traditions shaped during wetter centuries. When prediction failed, faith in cosmic order faltered. Spiritual responses to drought became increasingly dramatic. Kings and priests performed bloodletting ceremonies hoping to restore rainfall through divine negotiation. Captured prisoners were sacrificed atop temple pyramids, their blood offered to gods associated with rain and maize. Entire cities held massive ritual gatherings, sometimes involving thousands of worshippers chanting for celestial mercy. Yet the rain did not return consistently. Instead, drought cycles repeated, becoming longer and more severe. Inscriptions show kings publicly justifying their rule by declaring divine resilience against natural threat. But as the drought deepened, that justification wore thin. Environmental pressure also reshaped settlement patterns. Rural farmers abandoned distant homes and moved closer to forest edges or into swampy zones where water sources survived. Others left major cities entirely, seeking wetter regions to the north or coastal areas where fish and saltwater ecosystems provided stability. Migration fractured population networks, weakened political loyalty, and reduced the labor force needed to maintain city infrastructure. Terraces collapsed without upkeep. Fields went to weeds. Roads cracked under neglect. The great Maya urban world was slowly hollowing out. Trade networks suffered too. Drought forced cities into competition for limited resources. Obsidian, once plentiful from highland suppliers, became expensive as caravan routes slowed under instability. Salt production, which required heat and stable coastline communities, faltered as maritime trade declined. Cacao plantations dried, reducing one of the Maya's most treasured luxury goods. These shortages weakened elite prestige and urban identity. When nobles could no longer acquire jade ornaments or cacao drinks, the cultural symbolism of power changed. Society grew more equal, not by choice, but by deprivation. Architectural abandonment provides another window into the crisis. Many Maya cities halted monument carving during the worst drought periods. Stele that once celebrated coronations or victories grew scarce. Some monuments from this era show rushed craftsmanship, smaller imagery, and reused stone blocks from older structures. This recycling reveals two things. First, that new limestone quarries were no longer sustainable. Second, that optimism for the future was fading. A civilization confident in tomorrow builds from fresh stone. A civilization unsure of tomorrow uses what it already has. Reconstruction of drought timelines shows a devastating pattern. First came short dry intervals lasting a few years. Then came decades-long cycles that destroyed agricultural continuity. When combined with political warfare, disease spread, and internal social strain, the drought crisis became overwhelming. Maya kings lacked centralized power to manage food distribution across distant regions. Instead, each city-state was left to fend for itself, competing ruthlessly for precious water. Mutual distrust replaced cooperation, and this disunity magnified the environmental disaster. Thus, the Great Maya droughts were not a single event. They were a slow and grinding catastrophe that reshaped identity, faith, population, and political stability. They were not merely shortages of water. They were collapses of belief systems, disruptions of trade, and disintegrations of cities that depended on predictability. The climate crisis was one of the great turning points in Maya history, revealing that nature, once their ally, had become their most powerful adversary. While drought alone did not destroy the Maya world, the social reactions to environmental crisis created a chaotic chain reaction that pushed the civilization toward collapse. When water began disappearing, it was not just a physical resource vanishing. It was the removal of cultural security, political legitimacy, and cosmic identity. Every aspect of Maya society depended on rainfall. Their calendars were built around it, their religious ceremonies honored it, and their economic systems assumed it. So, when the skies withheld storm clouds year after year, the entire worldview of the Maya faced a direct psychological confrontation. What if the world order they believed in was failing? The psychological impact of drought was profound. For centuries, Maya kings had promised protection and stability through divine communication. They performed bloodletting ceremonies to open channels to ancestors, gods, and supernatural beings associated with rain and agriculture. But as drought cycles intensified, people began wondering whether their kings were actually blessed or simply mortal. This growing doubt slowly eroded the foundations of kingship. Leadership became harder to justify, especially in cities where famine hit first. We see this reflected in archaeological evidence. Some rulers vanished from inscriptions entirely, suggesting dethronement, assassination, or abandonment. The disappearance of dynastic lines symbolized not just political breakdown, but spiritual failure. Common people reacted differently depending on region and local culture. In some areas, community networks strengthened as families worked together to survive. Food sharing became a survival strategy, and religious festivals evolved into social support gatherings. But in other places, survival instincts created division. Villages fought over dwindling wells, raided one another's maize fields, and defended irrigation canals with violence. Archaeologists have located burnt farming settlements and hastily constructed palisades, proof that desperation fractured communities once connected by kinship. Religious transformation reveals another layer of crisis. As rain failed, traditional gods, like Chak, the Maya rain deity, became the focus of increasingly intense rituals. People painted Chak symbols in caves, placed offerings into dry cenotes, and prayed at shrines that were never used before. Some scholars suggest that the drought forced the Maya to revive older, rural religious practices, ones predating royal dynasties. These grassroots rituals bypassed kings, making priests and local spiritual leaders more influential. As royal power shrank, local religious authority expanded, drastically rebalancing society. Meanwhile, drought sharply divided rich and poor. Elites, protected by stored food and tribute goods, survived longer. They used resources to maintain political theater, rituals, feasts, and public ceremonies, hoping to preserve loyalty. But as commoners starved and watched elites continue luxury consumption, resentment intensified. This anger erupted into uprisings, attacks on palaces, and abandonment of elite compounds. Carved monuments showed damage not from weathering, but from deliberate smashing by human hands. This rebellion was not simply against individuals. It was against the system itself. The collapse of agricultural stability forced widespread migration. People left the central lowlands, such as Tikal, Copan, and Caracol, and moved north into the Yucatan Peninsula, where rainfall remained more consistent. Others went toward the Caribbean coast or highland valleys in Guatemala. This migration created powerful demographic shifts. Formerly thriving cities emptied, while frontier regions expanded. But these new settlements struggled to develop quickly enough to absorb incoming populations. Crowding, disease, and social conflict became common. Ironically, the strength of the Maya, urban concentration, became a weakness when the environment no longer supported dense populations. Water management also broke down. Reservoirs, canals, aqueducts, and cisterns required constant upkeep. Without laborers, the maintenance system collapsed. Reservoirs filled with sediment. Canals dried out. Limestone cistern walls cracked under temperature stress. Some communities attempted emergency engineering solutions: deep artificial wells, rain traps, and carved cave storage chambers. Yet these efforts were often too little, too late. The drought cycles lasted years, sometimes decades, and the engineering innovation could not match the magnitude of environmental change. Trade systems further deteriorated. Jade from Motagua Valley, obsidian from the Mexican highlands, and salt from coastal sources became unreliable commodities. When drought damaged crops, food became too valuable to trade. Luxury markets collapsed, shaking elite power. Tribute payments shifted from valuable goods to simple survival items like maize, salt, and clay pots. This shrinking economic network pushed many cities into isolation, fostering localism over shared identity. Cultural expression mirrored emotional collapse. We find murals depicting violent storms, lightning gods, skeletal spirits, and fear. Some carvings show rulers pleading with divine beings instead of commanding them. The confident cosmology of the classic period transitioned into a theology of crisis, filled with uncertainty, death symbolism, and apocalyptic timing. It is crucial to recognize that drought alone did not erase Maya civilization. The Mayas survived droughts before and after the classic collapse. What made these droughts different was the timing. They struck when population was at its peak, when forests were already thinning, when warfare was intensifying, when the political system was unstable, and when trade networks were stressed. Drought did not break a perfect system, it broke a weakened one. To fully grasp how drought transformed Maya civilization, we must examine how this environmental change affected systems of knowledge, identity, and cultural continuity. The Maya were not passive victims of climate. They were deliberate thinkers, scientific observers, and experienced astronomers who had documented seasonal patterns for hundreds of years. Yet, even with their advanced understanding of the natural world, they faced an unpredictable and prolonged environmental shift that challenged every assumption they had about the cosmos. Population density also played a role in rising conflict. As cities grew, housing expanded outward, pushing settlement zones closer together. Rival communities could be separated by only a few kilometers, increasing border tensions. Farmers working in disputed territories risked raids, crop destruction, or kidnap. Over time, warfare disrupted agriculture and trade patterns, creating cycles of scarcity that intensified social stress. These tensions were not temporary. They lasted generations and became part of Maya identity. Children grew up hearing stories of ancestral victories, revenge obligations, and cosmic warfare that demanded continuation. Religion amplified these conflicts. Maya rulers believed battlefield triumphs pleased the gods and ensured agricultural fertility. Some glyphs indicate that victories were celebrated with large sacrificial ceremonies believed to bring rain or secure divine favor. Defeat, on the other hand, might be interpreted as cosmic punishment. This spiritual connection made war politically necessary. If a king failed to wage war successfully, his divine legitimacy weakened, potentially inspiring rebellion among nobles or commoners. Despite all this competition, Maya cities also shared cultural unity. They spoke related languages, traded ceremonial objects, and produced similar art styles. Festivals across distant regions celebrated the same gods, demonstrating cultural cohesion beneath political rivalry. Ironically, this unity made warfare even more devastating. Cities that were culturally connected understood one another's tactics, beliefs, and vulnerabilities. Battles took place between people who shared religion and language, making civil war as common as external conflict. This growing complexity made the classic Maya world magnificent, but unstable. Political glory demanded endless achievement. Rulers had to build higher temples, win more battles, and sponsor greater ceremonies than their ancestors. As pressures increased, resources thinned, and population surged, the system began to strain. Soon, rivalries that once represented honor and cosmic duty would become draining wars that fractured alliances, weakened food networks, and helped push the Maya world toward collapse. To complete our understanding of the Maya classic era, We must examine daily life inside the great cities at their height, because the story of ordinary people reveals how deeply society depended on unity, stability, and tradition. Maya civilization was not simply composed of powerful kings and elite nobles. It was supported by thousands of laborers, craftspeople, merchants, artists, farmers, and servants whose lives shaped the foundations on which rulers stood. Their work built pyramids, sustained armies, fed cities, and maintained the cultural strength that allowed urban centers to grow larger than almost any civilization in the Americas at the time. Without these individuals and their complex social roles, Maya power would have collapsed centuries earlier. Daily urban life varied dramatically across class boundaries. Maya nobles lived within palace compounds built around courtyards filled with carved lintels, stucco masks, painted murals, and altars. These elites wore clothing dyed with brilliant pigments, including Maya blue, a color still studied by scientists today because of its mysterious chemical resilience. Jewelry made of jade, shells, feathers, and obsidian decorated both men and women. Nobles lived lives surrounded by ritual and responsibility. They held feasts, hosted consultations with scribes and astronomers, and raised children expected to continue dynastic service. Their days involved diplomacy, religious obligation, reading texts, and crafting political strategy. In contrast, the common people lived in simpler households made of wood, thatch, and wattle and daub. Entire neighborhoods formed around family lineages. Multiple generations often shared compounds containing small gardens, storage pits, cooking areas, and craft workshops. Many Maya farmers worked tirelessly from dawn to dusk, tending maize fields. The milpa agricultural system rotated crops to keep soil fertile. Maize was grown alongside beans and squash, creating natural nutrient balance. Gathering firewood, producing pottery, weaving textiles, hunting, and fishing supplemented the diet. Life was not easy, but it was structured, meaningful, and integrated into ritual cycles. The Maya landscape was filled with sound. Children playing in courtyards, women grinding maize on stone metates that echoed rhythmically throughout the day, and artisans shaping clay or carving stone. Markets formed the beating heart of economic and social interaction. In large plazas, traders sold cacao, honey, chili peppers, salt, cotton cloth, obsidian blades, jade ornaments, tobacco, and carved figurines. These markets were crowded, noisy, and essential for survival. They also served as political communication hubs where news about wars, marriages, deaths, and dynastic changes spread rapidly. Religion shaped each day. Families lit incense before household altars. Even common homes contained figurines representing gods associated with rain, agriculture, and health. For major ceremonies, entire communities gathered at central plazas to witness rituals led by kings and priests. Sound played an enormous role. Drums, flutes, trumpets, and conch shells echoed through plazas, creating overwhelming energy. These festivals strengthened identity and loyalty, making individuals feel part of something greater than themselves. Education for most Maya children came through apprenticeship rather than formal schooling. Sons learned weaving, farming, pottery, or masonry from parents. Daughters were trained in textile production, food preparation, and child-rearing skills. Elite children, however, received special training in writing, mathematics, astronomy, and diplomacy. This educational distinction reinforced class separation and ensured that knowledge remained in controlled circles. Yet skilled artisans, though technically commoners, often gained respect and economic comfort. Painters, architects, and sculptors contributed masterpieces still admired today. The Maya diet was nutritious but vulnerable to drought. Maize was the staple, forming the spiritual and nutritional basis of life. Beans and squash completed essential protein needs. Meat came from deer, rabbits, dogs, fish, and birds. Cacao served as both a drink and currency among elites. Yet because maize dominated so completely, crop failure could lead quickly to hunger. As city populations swelled, urban areas depended heavily on surrounding farmland, increasing ecological pressure. Farmers expanded terraces onto hillsides and cut into forest edges. Soil depletion and erosion became ongoing challenges, silently reshaping future history. Social order was enforced not only through belief, but through law and authority. Maya leaders punished theft, violence, and rebellion. While exact legal systems remain partly unknown, artistic and archaeological evidence shows that rulers took justice seriously. Maintaining public order was necessary for construction projects, agriculture, and expanding armies. This strong social structure made Maya cities stable for centuries, but also created rigidity. When pressure increased later, the same structure made reform difficult. Maya cities were intellectual powerhouses. Libraries of painted codices once filled elite chambers. Astronomy platforms lined palace roofs. Scribes recorded each major event with careful attention to dates and symbols. Timekeeping was central to Maya identity. Every day had spiritual meaning, and life moved according to calendar predictions. The drought crisis was not only physical, it was intellectual, cultural, and existential. The world, as they knew, it was changing faster than tradition could adapt. One crucial element in this intellectual struggle was the Maya calendar system. For centuries, priests and astronomers used a combination of 3 calendar cycles, the Hab, the Tsokin, and the Long Count, to track ritual events, agricultural seasons, and cosmic cycles. These calendars helped forecast planting schedules and predicted seasonal rainfall patterns. But when drought cycles arrived with irregular timing, even expert astronomers were powerless to correct their predictions. Ritual days intended to mark the planting or harvesting season became symbolic instead of practical. Priests performed ceremonies on mathematically correct dates, yet the rain they expected did not fall. This failure produced an ideological crisis. If sacred time could not be trusted to produce natural results, the entire worldview linking religion and environment became unstable. The educational system suffered as well. Royal scribes, once respected for their mastery of astronomy, writing, and mathematics, lost cultural authority when their knowledge failed to prevent famine and drought. Inscription frequency declined dramatically, especially in the southern lowlands. Many stelae from this period are unfinished, broken, or never erected at all. Some may have been abandoned mid-carving because resources or labor collapsed during the project. This interruption in historical record-keeping contributed to the cultural erasure of dynasties. Without written continuity, future generations lost access to names, rituals, and cosmological understanding. The drought also changed agriculture itself. Maya farmers, once confident in maize cultivation, were forced to modify traditional methods. This obsession with time encouraged long-term planning, but also generated cultural pressure. If calendars or rituals predicted droughts or cosmic shifts, society reacted to expectation rather than observation. What makes Maya daily life particularly compelling is how balanced it once seemed. There was hardship, but there was also beauty. There was hierarchy, but also shared identity. The civilization did not appear doomed. Quite the opposite. The classic era represented strength, stability, and cultural pride. That reality makes the eventual collapse far more dramatic. Ordinary life had become deeply integrated into the system. When the upper structure weakened, the entire social fabric unraveled. People abandoned their homes, fields, plazas, and temples not because they were simple villagers, but because they were part of an interconnected world that no longer functioned. The Maya classic world was therefore a brilliant machine made of millions of moving human parts. Once stress fractured the gears of leadership, agriculture, environment, and warfare, the entire structure became unsustainable. This understanding prepares us to enter the next phase of history, a period when the Golden Age began showing visible cracks. To understand how the Maya civilization ultimately fell, historians and archaeologists pay special attention to the subtle warning signs that appeared long before the famous city abandonments. Collapse is never a sudden moment in time. It is a long sequence of pressures building silently beneath the surface, accumulating over generations until the system can no longer support its own structure. The Maya classic era, while rich and powerful, began showing cracks centuries before the catastrophic breakdown. These early signals reveal that the Maya world was entering a dangerous and unsustainable path, marked by environmental stress, political upheaval, population strain, and ideological rigidity. One of the earliest warnings came from dramatic population growth. During the height of the classic period, population estimates suggest millions lived across the Maya lowlands. Cities swelled into dense urban networks connected by causeways and trade routes. But Maya agriculture, despite being innovative, was still vulnerable to natural limits. Forests were cleared to create fields, terraces, and new housing districts. After centuries of expansion, farmers reached the edge of available arable land. Soil fertility began to decline. Fresh spaces for new farms ran out. Farmers moved farther away from city centers, increasing transportation burdens and weakening urban dependency structures. These problems did not appear overnight. They slowly emerged from the success of the civilization itself. Environmental stress accompanied demographic rise. Evidence of deforestation is visible in pollen records taken from lakes and swamps across the Maya lowlands. Tree pollen decreases steadily after 500 CE, replaced by maize and grass pollen, showing that forests were being cut at large scale. Removing forests damaged soil structure, increased erosion, and reduced local rainfall retention. In a rainforest environment where water availability varies dramatically by season, such ecological disruption had long-term consequences. Deforestation reduced water tables, made droughts more severe, and forced communities to depend on increasingly complex water management systems. Reservoirs, canals, and cistern systems were built to store rainwater, but these infrastructure projects required constant labor and elite supervision. Elite-driven monument construction also intensified societal pressure. Kings across Maya cities participated in a competitive architectural arms race, attempting to outshine rivals through larger temples, decorated plazas, and sculpted monuments. These projects benefited political prestige and religious authority, but they consumed enormous amounts of labor, resources, and food. Workers who labored on pyramids were often taken away from agricultural cycles, weakening food security. Constant construction also demanded limestone, wood, and plaster, encouraging further deforestation. The irony becomes clear. Maya cities built monuments to celebrate victory and stability. Yet these very monuments contributed to weakening the foundations of their world. Signs of political instability appeared as well. Hieroglyphic records describe increased warfare, shifting alliances, and dynastic assassinations. The once stable routes of diplomacy gave way to violent conquest campaigns. Smaller city-states, pressured by regional powers, faced tribute demands, raids, and forced loyalty. The ideological system of divine kingship was powerful during success, but during hardship it became heavy. A king who promised cosmic balance needed to prove his worth through victories and monumental achievements. When defeats occurred, trust eroded. People began questioning whether their rulers still possessed sacred approval from the gods. Religious expectations also became unsustainable. In prosperous times, sacrifice and ritual were accepted cultural norms. But when crops failed or war destroyed fields, people struggled to understand why the gods were not responding. Ritual leaders increased demands for ceremonies, sacrifices, and tribute, offering spiritual explanations for material problems. The more society suffered, the heavier the religious burden grew. For many rural populations, supporting cities that required increasing tax and ritual contributions became economically and emotionally exhausting. Evidence also shows that climate change entered the Maya story earlier than many once believed. Modern sediment and isotope studies reveal recurring drought cycles beginning in the 500s and 600 CE, long before the final collapse. These droughts did not destroy cities instantly, but they created waves of hunger, trade disruption, and migration. When rain returned, temporary recovery occurred. But each drought left deeper scars, pushing communities toward resource conflict and political stress. Trade networks also began shifting. Once thriving exchange routes saw increasing competition and political interference. As rival cities blocked or taxed goods, economic systems became fragile. Wealth inequality rose sharply between noble elites and common people. Large royal courts consumed resources at increasing rates, creating resentment. Archaeological findings show nutritional decline among commoners during the late Classic period, suggesting that benefits of growth were not equally shared. Together, these early warning signs foreshadowed collapse. The Maya world was still strong and vibrant, but its foundations were beginning to tremble. Prosperity was becoming weight, strength was becoming fragility, and cultural brilliance was slowly turning into unsustainable expectation. As the classic Maya world moved deeper into the 7th and 8th centuries, the social and political climate across the lowlands became increasingly unstable. Although city-states remained active, powerful, and culturally impressive, cracks in the system were widening. These cracks can be clearly observed in the archaeological record. Abandoned construction projects, broken trade connections, uncarved monuments, burned palaces, declining inscriptions, and rural migration patterns. Together, they reveal the slow unraveling of a once unified system. What makes this period fascinating is not only the decline itself, but the way Maya communities responded to it, through adaptation, resistance, conflict, and spiritual desperation. This was not a calm descent. It was a centuries-long struggle between the forces that held society together and the forces tearing it apart. One of the most noticeable warning signs is the dramatic increase in warfare intensity. The 7th century conflicts between rival cities grew more destructive, transitioning from ritualized battles to wars of political annihilation. Early classic warfare often focused on capturing nobles to validate prestige. However, late classic warfare targeted entire cities, populations, and food systems. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of massacre pits, fortified walls built rapidly around once open cities, and weapon deposits buried inside burned structures. These findings show that war was not merely political theater. It became an existential threat. The epic rivalry between Tikal and Uxmal, which had shaped Maya politics for generations, entered a more desperate phase. When one superpower gained advantage, alliances shifted violently across the lowlands. Cities like Karakol, Copan, Dos Pilas, Naranjo, and Quirigua played key roles in proxy conflicts. Some inscriptions describe cities changing sides more than once within a single generation, demonstrating how unstable diplomacy had become. These political earthquakes strained resources, increased taxation, and placed enormous pressure on farmers who needed to feed armies. War also interfered with planting cycles, since men who left farms to fight often returned to damaged or lost crops. Elite competition intensified in cultural expression as well. Kings felt compelled to build ever more elaborate monuments to prove divine authority. Yet as resources tightened, new monuments began to shrink in scale and craftsmanship. Inscriptions became shorter, less frequent, and increasingly desperate in tone. Symbolic choices in architecture also changed. Instead of constructing grand temples for public display, some cities built hurried defensive structures, such as walls around ceremonial plazas and barricades blocking causeways. This shift reveals that rulers were no longer competing to impress rivals. They were struggling to survive them. The artistic record also hints at insecurity. Sculptures from the late classics show anger and grief. Bound captives, tortured prisoners, and exaggerated dominant scenes. Pain became a visual language. Some stele depict rulers performing bloodletting rituals with distress, almost as if the art itself were pleading for divine rescue. Art stopped celebrating peace and abundance, turning instead to warfare imagery, political propaganda, and dark religious iconography. These documents show that society recognized its own fragility. Environmental instability worsened the situation. Climate research reveals multiple prolonged drought cycles between 650 and 800 CE. These were not short dry seasons. They were years-long shortages of rain that devastated crop growth. Maya farmers depended on seasonal rainfall, and without it, maize field withered. Forest removal amplified the problem. Environments lacking tree cover could not retain water, causing rivers and reservoirs to dry quickly. As agricultural returns declined, urban centers became overcrowded islands surrounded by failing farmland. Hunger spread, leading some communities to abandon cities entirely and migrate towards smaller settlements near rivers or coastal regions where fishing could supplement diets. Social inequality also began to fracture unity. While rural families starved, elite courts continued demanding tribute. Nobles expected feasts, luxury goods, and monumental labor even during crisis. This widening gap produced disillusionment. Rebellion traces have been discovered in multiple cities. Burned palaces, toppled sculptures, and smashed dynastic portraits. These ruins are physical testimonies of internal conflict, showing that collapse was not only caused by drought or war, it erupted from within. Trade networks that once tied the Maya world together weakened. Obsidian distribution patterns changed dramatically, indicating lost access to key suppliers. Some cities that once traded widely became isolated. Coastal commerce shifted north toward rising centers in the Yucatan, reducing political influence in the southern lowlands. Economic breakdown forced cities to rely on local resources that were already overtaxed, deepening the spiral of scarcity. Spiritual confidence also faltered. As drought continued and warfare escalated, kings intensified rituals to convince people that divine order could still be restored. Bloodletting ceremonies became more frequent, and evidence suggests sacrificial practices grew heavier. But the fact that rituals increased while crises worsened shook public belief. When religion failed to bring rain or peace, people were left questioning the foundations of their worldview. This ideological doubt weakened the cultural glue holding the civilization together. What is striking is how interconnected every weakness became. Environmental decline increased warfare. Warfare damageait l'agriculture. Agriculture failure fueled rebellion. Rebellion weakened political legitimacy. Loss of legitimacy crippled religion. Every system fed pressure into another, until society resembled an overstrained machine grinding against itself. The late classic Maya world was therefore not a quiet civilization waiting for collapse. It was a living society fighting to survive. Cities attempted reforms, redrew borders, built defenses, and forged new alliances. Many communities resisted decline for generations, but the systems they depended on, environment, economy, religion, and political unity, were deteriorating too quickly to repair. To complete our exploration of early warning signs within the Maya world, we must investigate the internal cultural tensions that developed as pressure mounted. These tensions did not receive the same attention as warfare or drought in early archaeological studies, but modern research shows they played a crucial role in shaping the downfall. Beneath the impressive cities, cosmic temples, and outward strength, Maya society was wrestling with identity conflicts. Between tradition and adaptation, rural and urban priorities, religious demands and agricultural reality, elite privilege and common hardship. These conflicts slowly undermined the unity that had supported Maya civilization for centuries. One major cultural fault line was the expectation placed on Maya leadership. Kings were not simply political rulers. They were spiritual intermediaries believed to maintain cosmic balance. For centuries, divine kingship worked because rulers succeeded. They expanded cities, secured resources, won wars, and ensured prosperity. But as environmental stress and warfare worsened, the ideological foundation beneath kingship began to crack. When rain stopped falling or armies returned defeated, ordinary families questioned whether their rulers still possessed divine approval. The king's blood was believed to carry sacred power, but if sacrifice after sacrifice failed to produce results, faith turned to doubt. This ideological shift is visible in artistic and architectural decline. Fewer monuments were constructed, fewer stelae were carved, and inscriptions began recording shorter, less confident reigns. Communities responded differently to crisis, depending on geography and local conditions. Some urban centers doubled down on tradition, committing more labor to religious monuments in a desperate attempt to stabilize cosmic favor. Others appear to have shifted away from elite control, decentralizing power to community leaders and councils. Archaeological excavations at certain smaller sites show rising autonomy among neighborhoods, suggesting that local leaders assumed authority as central dynasties weakened. These regional variations show that collapse was not uniform. It unfolded through countless social experiments, successes, failures, and migrations. The Maya economy also experienced ideological strain. Trade had once been a source of cultural strength, proudly connecting distant cities into a network of shared goods and ideas. But as warfare blocked travel routes and drought reduced agricultural surplus, trade became less reliable. When merchants could not provide jade, cacao, obsidian, feathers, salt, and textiles as expected, elites lost symbolic legitimacy. Luxuries disappeared from burials. Household items became simpler. Imported goods declined sharply in style and volume. Material culture reflects social mood. Where once vibrant colors and elegant shapes flourished, later pottery often reveals rushed workmanship and reduced variety. This decline was not purely economic. It was emotional. It reflected a civilization lowering its expectations for the future. Another emerging problem was the transformation of religious doctrine. Traditionally, Maya belief focused on cosmic cycles and ancestral authority. But during the late Classic, new religious imagery began appearing in murals and monuments, symbolic messages that seemed to emphasize apocalyptic anxiety. Scholars have noticed increased depictions of skeletal gods, underworld imagery, and death symbolism, along with ritual scenes portraying suffering rather than triumph. These visual patterns suggest people feared profound cosmic imbalance. Religion, instead of offering stability, began mirroring the chaos around them. Social pressure increased at the family level as well. Commoners who once supported elite lifestyles through food production and labor now face starvation and exhaustion. Families living farther from cities had to walk miles to meet tribute demands. Failure to provide goods or labor could lead to punishment. Such pressure risked eroding loyalty between rulers and the people they depended on. Archaeologists believe entire villages fled into peripheral areas, preferring independence over subservience to struggling elites. These evacuations weakened cities. Once population declined, irrigation networks failed, terraces collapsed, and farmland quickly became wild again. The ball game, once a cultural celebration, also took on darker significance. Courts built during the late Classic appear more defensive in layout, and some inscriptions link ball games to executions. The shift reflects a society using spectacle to reinforce political authority during times of doubt. Entertainment, ritual, and fear blended together in a desperate attempt to maintain order. Another sign of rising fragility was the decline of literacy. Early Classic inscriptions demonstrate flourishing writing traditions, rich in complexity and careful detail. But toward the end of the Classic era, inscriptions appear rushed, formulaic, and repetitive. Fewer scribes trained to master the complex hieroglyphic script, suggesting intellectual decline and reduced educational infrastructure. When the educated elite shrank, historical continuity weakened. Societies that once recorded every king's birth, marriage, and war victory gradually stopped writing. This loss of information mirrored a loss of confidence in the future. A world full of crisis stops thinking about historical memory. These acts were not random vandalism. They were symbolic. Destroying royal faces carved in stone was a direct rejection of divine kingship. The collapse of ideology often takes form in the destruction of its symbols. Religion, which once unified southern capitals, began producing division. State-led religion required massive population participation, huge temples, public plazas, and organized festivals. But as people left and cities shrank, religious power moved into households and villages. Local gods replaced state gods. Ancestor worship became more important than ruler worship. Ritual authority slipped away from kings and priests toward families, midwives, village shamans, and community elders. This decentralization weakened elite power further because religion had been one of its strongest tools. The collapse also altered identity networks. Southern Maya capitals had long been cultural beacons, training scribes, producing astronomers, and controlling intellectual tradition. But as these capitals crumbled, intellectual life deteriorated. Literacy rates fell dramatically. Scribes lost patrons and positions. Students no longer attended palace schools. Hieroglyphic writing almost disappeared from the southern lowlands, ending centuries of recorded royal history. Without written tradition, local memory took over, and memory is subjective, flexible, and easily reshaped. This loss of written identity meant collapse cut deeper into cultural consciousness than any war could. Population decline in the southern capitals was staggering. Archaeologists estimate that some regions lost over 70% of their population within a century. Such depopulation is not simply abandonment. It is social death. Entire neighborhoods that once held families for generations were left ghostly and overgrown. Abandoned plazas filled with wind-blown leaves. Reservoirs stagnated. Temple stairs cracked under tree roots. Houses collapsed into grass-covered mounds. Occupational layers abruptly end in excavation trenches. marking the final moment people lived in those spaces. Trade disruption intensified the collapse. Major southern capitals had served as hubs for long-distance commerce. They traded jade from Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland Guatemala and Mexico, and cacao from humid jungles. When warfare disrupted roads, rivers, and coastal access, elites could no longer distribute luxury goods. Without these symbols of divine favor, their persuasion weakened. People began to question whether rulers truly mediated between humans and gods. When the holy symbols vanished, faith in leadership thinned. Food shortages changed social politics. Hunger erodes loyalty. Where once farmers delivered maize willingly, now they hid grain stores. Tribute avoidance became widespread, forcing elites to pressure communities even harder. Some rulers likely responded with punishment, enslavement, land seizure, or forced labor, but coercion only increased resentment. Over time, tribute stopped entirely in many cities, turning kings into powerless figureheads without armies or supporters. Regionalism grew as the South fractured. Cities that once shared cultural identity began treating each other as rivals instead of allies. This rivalry worsened during drought years when water and farmland became mortal resources. As unity faded, the cultural coherence that once framed the Maya as a single great civilization dissolved into countless micro-identities. Southern collapse also reshaped burial traditions. Before decline, elite tombs were rich with jade jewelry, painted ceramics, and obsidian blades. But during late occupation layers, grave goods became increasingly humble. Bone tools, simple pots, shells, and few ornaments. This shift shows the erosion of wealth and social complexity. When elites no longer received elaborate burials, the class system was dying. Even architectural choices reflect ideological change. Late buildings show rushed workmanship, smaller scale, reused stones, and fewer decorative elements. In a once great capital like Piedras Negras, grand architecture simply stopped. New construction focused on practicality, defensive walls, storage pits, and wells instead of palaces or pyramids. This utilitarian shift reveals desperation, not ambition. Coping strategies varied widely. Some communities tried diplomacy to survive, aligning with new powers in the north. Others resisted, turning to violence or isolation. Some cities attempted reforms, reducing tribute, reorganizing councils, redistributing land. But these efforts did not produce lasting success because the environmental foundation remained unstable. Reform cannot succeed without resources. The collapse of the southern capitals also reflects generational psychology. Older adults who remembered prosperous times must have felt profound grief watching their cities fall. Younger people, however, may have viewed collapse as a new beginning rather than an ending. For them, the old order was history, not memory. They learned new languages, new trade skills, and new cultural practices. This generational divide could explain why abandonment accelerated so rapidly. It is essential to understand that collapse was not uniform or predetermined. Some southern cities declined early, others held on for decades. But eventually, the combined pressures, environmental destruction, warfare, political breakdown, internal rebellion, and social exhaustion, made continuation impossible. The collapse of the southern capitals represents the point where the classic Maya became something different. The pillars that supported their civilization, dynastic kingship, monumental building, urban concentration, complex agriculture, and elite ideology, fell away, leaving only the enduring cultural spirit of the Maya people that complete the story of the southern Maya collapse. We must explore the long-term consequences of losing these major urban centers. The disappearance of southern capitals did not mark the end of Maya civilization, but it signaled a radical cultural transformation that reshaped population patterns, language networks, and political identity. The fall of these iconic cities sent ripples across Mesoamerica, influencing everything from international trade to religious tradition. Understanding the aftermath allows us to see not only what collapsed, but what survived, adapted, and evolved in the centuries that followed. The decline of the southern capitals changed the demographic map of the Maya region forever. Before collapse, the southern lowlands housed dense populations supported by terrace agriculture and advanced water engineering. When the capitals fell, people scattered in waves. Some migrated north into the Yucatan Peninsula, where rainfall remained more consistent and cities like Chichén Itzá and Uxmal were rising. Others moved westward into the highlands and volcanic valleys of Guatemala and Chiapas, where cooler temperatures and river-fed soils offered greater agricultural stability. This mass movement diversified Maya society, spreading ideas, languages, and cultural practices across new territories. The southern Maya world was emptying, but the culture was spreading. Migration became a force of rebirth rather than extinction. New settlements created syncretic identities. Imagine a group of families leaving Copán, walking north, carrying tools, memories, seeds, and stories. When they reached new communities, they blended their customs with those of local populations. Pottery styles mixed, dialects merged, architectural building methods fused together. This cultural blending helped form the foundation for post-classic Maya civilization. Collapse did not erase culture. It reorganized it into something more flexible, shared, and widely distributed. Trade networks also adapted. With the southern capitals gone, the infrastructure that once supported massive trade hubs shifted north. Ports along the Caribbean coast and the Gulf of Mexico grew more influential. Routes connecting highland obsidian sources to coastal salt and cacao production reorganized through different cities. Merchant communities, forced to abandon their old markets, followed caravans to new trade centers. Northern cities, such as Chichén Itzá, benefited greatly from this shift. They became the new economic engines of Maya civilization. Another long-term consequence was the redistribution of intellectual knowledge. Southern capitals like Tikal and Copán once housed the most advanced scribes, mathematicians, and astronomers. As these experts migrated, they brought with them advanced learning systems. Knowledge, once concentrated in palace libraries, spread into smaller communities. This created a decentralized but resilient intellectual culture. The Maya calendar survived. Astronomy survived. Ritual language survived. Instead of collapsing into ignorance, knowledge adapted to survive without royal institutions. The collapse also influenced Maya belief systems. Kingship, once the sacred foundation of Maya religion, lost prestige. Instead of worshiping divine rulers, communities turned more deeply toward local gods, ancestors, and nature spirits. Beliefs became more localized, less hierarchical, and more community-oriented. Rituals evolved to match everyday realities rather than elite ideology. This shift helped Maya religion survive drought, famine, and migration. Without royal requirements, religion became more personal and accessible. Meanwhile, the abandoned capitals slowly transformed into mythological landscapes. As forests reclaimed temples and plazas, these cities became symbolic places in Maya memory. Families who migrated sometimes spoke of their abandoned homes in stories, places of ancestors, spirits, and origins. Later Maya communities would visit ruins for pilgrimage, remembrance, or ritual offerings. Even today, many Maya people consider ancient cities to be alive with spiritual power. This connection demonstrates continuity despite collapse. A particularly important outcome of southern collapse was political decentralization. The Maya had always governed through city-states, but southern cities were once dominant power brokers. Their disappearance opened space for new forms of leadership. In the north, political models evolved into mixed systems that blended Maya ideas with Toltec influences. Council government structures appeared in some regions, where multiple leaders shared rule instead of relying on a single king. This political experimentation marks an important cultural evolution. It shows Maya society learning from collapse rather than repeating the same mistakes. Economically, the decline of the southern capitals dismantled the tribute taxation system. Once tribute networks vanished, economic relationships became based on trade, cooperation, and specialization rather than compulsory labor. Communities survived through barter and flexible local markets. This shift empowered rural populations, decreasing elite oppression and increasing local autonomy. Perhaps the deepest legacy of the Southern collapse is the archaeological record it left behind. Because so many cities were abandoned rapidly, many artifacts remained untouched for more than a millennium. These ruins preserve details of ancient life that cities with continuous occupation might have lost. The silence of abandonment became a preservation tool. Today, archaeologists studying sites like Tikal, Köpen, and Karakol can reconstruct daily life, architectural development, and social structure with extraordinary precision. Yet the ruins also tell a painful story. Broken vessels that once held offerings, tools left on palace floors, half-carved monuments abandoned mid-stroke, and farming terraces eroded by time. These objects reflect human choices made under impossible pressure. They are physical memories of fear, strength, love, and identity. They show that the Maya collapse was not a faceless tragedy. It was lived by individuals. The collapse of the southern capitals proved that civilizations do not simply end. They transform landscapes, values, and cultures long after their temples crumble. For the Maya, this transformation led to the post-classic period, centered not in the southern lowlands, but in the northern peninsula and highland regions. The next chapters of Maya history include resurgence, innovation, and new artistic styles, not oblivion. When the great Maya capitals of the southern lowlands fell silent, they left behind vast stone landscapes frozen in time. These abandoned cities became archaeological treasure vaults containing clues about daily life, social organization, economic systems, religious belief, and ultimately collapse. The ruins that modern archaeologists walk through today, overgrown courtyards, toppled stele, hidden reservoirs, and staircases swallowed by roots, are not simply ancient monuments. They are historical documents written in limestone, obsidian, and clay. Every wall fragment and buried artifact tells a piece of the story that texts and oral memory alone cannot reveal. The jungle reclaimed these cities with astonishing speed. Within only a few generations after abandonment, the rainforest canopy enveloped plazas, temples, and palaces. Creeping vines cracked plaster, tree roots pierced staircases, and moss covered carvings that once displayed ruler faces. Some communities shifted toward root crops like cassava, which required less water. Others practiced swidden agriculture, cutting and burning small forest patches to temporarily fertilize soil. But these changes brought heavy consequences. Swidden agriculture consumed more forest, increasing erosion and runoff, while root crop farming provided survival calories but weakened ritual identity, since maize was the sacred cultural foundation of Maya religion. Eating cassava instead of maize was not simply a dietary shift. It symbolized a break in cosmic identity. The Maya believed they were made from maize. A world where maize could no longer feed them was a world where identity itself was threatened. Cultural rituals evolved in response to the crisis. Rain-bringing ceremonies intensified, with incense, music, and chanting echoing across plazas once filled with celebration. But other rituals turned darker, focusing on death, sacrifice, and appeasement. Bones found in late classic ceremonial pits show signs of increased ritual use. Skeletal evidence suggests an age shift. Not only captured warriors, but children and nobles may have been sacrificed during drought years. This tragic pattern reflects social desperation. People believed that greater sacrifice might convince gods to restore cosmic order. The emotional burden of living through such ceremonies must have been overwhelming. Economic identity changed dramatically. Cities that once thrived as trade hubs became isolated pockets of survival. Jade workshops fell silent. Pottery specialization declined. Textile networks shrank. People reverted to simpler household crafts, producing cookware and tools for function rather than beauty. Artistic decline was more than economic loss. It reflected a shrinking worldview. Without time, resources, or optimism, art loses its brilliance. Civilization becomes inward, restrictive, and defensive. Village abandonment accelerated cultural transformation. Small communities left near drought-damaged farmland did not simply disappear. They relocated and formed new settlements with different political identities. These migration chains disrupted dynastic relationships and weakened loyalty to former rulers. Social identity became rooted in survival rather than heritage. Some migrants likely arrived in territories controlled by rival kings, increasing cultural tension. New populations created new competition over water and farmland, accelerating conflict. Another deeply significant change occurred within gender roles. Archaeological evidence suggests that women increasingly managed household survival tasks, as men left to fight or search for resources. Food preparation techniques shifted in response to scarcity. New grinding methods appeared, and women diversified diets using wild plants, herbs, and small animals. Artifact patterns show that household religious practice increased, suggesting that domestic spirituality became a source of emotional strength when public ritual failed. At the philosophical level, drought altered the Maya concept of time. The Maya believed history flowed in cycles of rise, destruction, and renewal. Myths described worlds destroyed by flood, fire, and divine wrath. When the drought persisted, people may have interpreted it as the beginning of a new ending cycle, a cosmic transition rather than a political failure. This worldview helped some communities endure psychologically, but it may also have encouraged fatalism. If collapse was cosmically destined, resistance might have felt futile. The Great Maya droughts introduced one more powerful danger: fragmentation of identity across regions. Northern Yucatan cities like Uxmal and Chichén Itzá, where rainfall was more stable, experienced cultural fluorescence while southern lowlands declined. This regional imbalance shifted population, trade, and influence, creating a new political map. Southern cities that once led the Maya world slowly lost cultural authority. Power moved north, but the strength could not unify a collapsing civilization. The Maya world was no longer a network of interdependent cities. It was breaking into isolated islands of survivors. By the end of the 8th century, the effects of drought were irreversible. Reservoirs cracked beyond repair. Dynasties lost symbolic meaning. Populations scattered, and the sacred cycle of maize farming collapsed. Even though the rainforest would eventually regrow and rain would return in future centuries, the cultural damage caused by the drought crisis could not be undone. A civilization built on harmony with nature found itself defeated by the very world it worshipped. This completes our examination of how drought reshaped Maya society at every level: spiritual, political, social, agricultural, and intellectual. The next part of the story will show how these pressures escalated into catastrophic political collapse. As the Maya world entered the 8th and early 9th centuries, warfare transformed from a traditional, ritualized institution into a driving force behind political disintegration. Conflict had always been part of Maya culture, but during earlier centuries it served ceremonial and dynastic purposes. Kings captured rival nobles to demonstrate spiritual superiority, and battles were orchestrated to reinforce cosmic order rather than achieve territorial destruction. However, as drought intensified and political systems weakened, the nature of Maya warfare shifted dramatically. Battles became longer, bloodier, and aimed at annihilation rather than symbolic triumph. Military action no longer projected divine legitimacy. It became a tool for survival, desperation, and regional domination. The two greatest military blocs of the Classic era, Tikal and Uxmal, had spent centuries competing for dominance over the lowlands. Their rivalry shaped political geography, forcing cities to choose alliances or risk isolation. For generations, the balance between these two superpowers prevented total fragmentation because their presence created order. Smaller cities knew where power lay, who to support, and how diplomacy worked. But once drought destabilized agriculture and tribute systems faltered, the old power balance began to shatter. Uxmal, once a mighty empire builder, suffered decline, and its network of allied cities began to fall away. Tikal regained influence for a time, but even its resurgence could not hold the region together. With the collapse of these power centers, a political vacuum opened across the lowlands. Into this vacuum rushed dozens of ambitious rulers, each attempting to carve out regional authority. Instead of two great powers controlling politics, 20 or 30 smaller cities began fighting independently. Warfare spread like wildfire, igniting between neighbors who once coexisted through trade and marriage alliances. Cities began to raid one another's farmland, burn terraces, destroy irrigation systems, and block trade routes. Warfare became a means to survive drought by stealing food, water, or land from rivals. The psychological shift was enormous. Fighting no longer symbolized cosmic reenactment between elites. It became a brutal struggle for daily existence. Archaeology reveals stunning evidence of these intensifying conflicts. Burned palaces and temple roofs show where cities suffered violent conquest. Arrowheads, spear points, and obsidian knives are found embedded in walls and skulls. Some settlements were abandoned suddenly, leaving behind cooking pots still full of food or valuables hidden under floors, never retrieved. At Dos Pilas, inscriptions describe a grim period when the ruling dynasty was forced to flee its capital, establishing new defensive towns deep in the forest. These emergency refuges were ringed by deep trenches, walls, and wooden palisades, unthinkable during earlier centuries of grandeur. The escalation of warfare also transformed the political ideology of kingship. Instead of focusing on monumental architecture and cosmic legitimacy, rulers now organized militarization, defensive engineering, and espionage. Some cities built watchtowers along causeways. Others constructed walls around ceremonial plazas. The very architecture of Maya cities shifted from open, welcoming spaces to fortified enclaves. This change represents the emotional and cultural transformation of a people who once envisioned their cities as reflections of cosmic harmony, but now saw them as targets. The Maya military also expanded its recruitment base. In earlier centuries, warfare was largely conducted by nobles and elite trained warriors. But as conflict intensified, kings enlisted common farmers, artisans, and even young boys to serve in armies. This militarization produced long-term economic damage. Farmers taken away from fields left crops untended, reducing food yield even further. The more men recruited for war, the fewer workers remained to plant, harvest, repair roads, and maintain reservoirs. War fed famine, and famine fed more war. Captives, once used for ritual display and sacrifice, now became political tools. Some victorious cities enslaved whole families and resettled them as labor forces. Others slaughtered captured nobles to prevent future rebellion. Inscriptions mention decapitation, mutilation, and mass sacrifice. These acts revealed desperation among rulers struggling to impress their people through violence when prosperity was no longer possible. Trade routes became battlefields. Kings sent raiding parties to seize goods moving through jungle roads or along rivers. The famous obsidian routes linking El Chale and Ixtepic to major cities became contested spaces. Without safe trade, artisan industries collapsed, reducing royal income and further weakening political stability. Even religion became weaponized. Rulers claimed that gods demanded war victories to restore cosmic order. Defeat was blamed on spiritual impurity or treason. People caught between rival rulers were forced to choose sides. Refusal could mean death or enslavement. Loyalty fragmented, and cultural unity dissolved. Perhaps most destructive was the breakdown of diplomatic tradition. In earlier centuries, marriage alliances prevented endless bloodshed. Cities united through royal unions, producing children who linked families and dynasties. But as drought and famine worsened, such marriages lost meaning. No alliance could guarantee food. No dynasty could guarantee reign. Diplomacy collapsed into survival calculus. One tragic effect of constant warfare was rural abandonment. Farmers, afraid of raids, left fertile fields unprotected. Some retreated deep into forests, living nomadically rather than under a king. Abandoned fields turned wild within a few seasons, making recovery nearly impossible. As farms vanished, cities starved. The urban population, once supported by vast agricultural networks, grew unsustainable when those networks crumbled. Social identity fractured during this era. Maya people no longer saw themselves as part of a unified cultural world. They saw themselves as subjects of whichever local ruler controlled water and food. The shared belief system that once tied cities together weakened dramatically. This cultural fragmentation was as devastating as the drought itself. Thus, Maya warfare in the late Classic era was not simply destructive, it was transformative. It reshaped political geography, redistributed population, redefined kingship, and accelerated collapse. Instead of unity through shared identity, the Maya world turned into a battlefield of desperate city-states fighting for survival in an environment that could no longer support them. At the center of the Maya collapse story lies the failure of kingship, a political system that once held social life together with powerful religious legitimacy. For centuries, Maya rulers were seen not simply as political leaders, but as divine intermediaries chosen by the gods to protect balance between the spiritual and material worlds. Their authority came from ancestry, ritual performance, and cosmic alignment. But during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, the crises of drought, famine, and escalating warfare exposed the vulnerabilities of this system. Kingship was built on the assumption of eternal success. It struggled to survive when disaster arrived. The collapse of kingship began subtly. In the early stages of decline, rulers responded to social pressure by increasing public spectacle. More rituals, more bloodletting, more celebrations of lineage, More construction projects meant to reinforce their sacred status. However, the very resources needed for this spectacle were drying up. Monument buildings slowed, and temples were not finished on time. Plaster cracked because mixtures lacked proper materials. Paint pigments became scarce due to the collapse of trade routes. These visible signs of weakness undermined public confidence. If a king could not maintain the sacred image of royal power, how could he be believed to control reign, victory, or prosperity? Political fragmentation further weakened dynasties. Many kings found themselves surrounded not only by external enemies, but also by internal rivals. In some cities, noble families took advantage of drought and famine to challenge royal authority. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of palaces burned from within, likely by local uprisings rather than foreign invasions. Inscriptions abruptly stop at certain sites, suggesting rulers were killed or expelled. Afterward, power did not always pass to a new king. In some cases, political structure dissolved entirely, leaving no one to replace the throne. This breakdown shows how deeply kingship depended on continuity. Without a successor to inherit divine legitimacy, entire systems of governance collapsed overnight. Another key issue was dynastic competition. Because Maya kings linked their legitimacy to family bloodlines, rival claimants could rise during crisis and argue their ancestry was more divinely legitimate. These battles over lineage created civil wars inside cities. Unlike external warfare, which at least united a population against outsiders, internal royal conflict shattered loyalty networks. Nobles and commoners were forced to choose between rival candidates. Cities that once celebrated dynastic stability suddenly found themselves torn apart by succession disputes. Kings also began losing their control over tribute systems. Tribute, whether in the form of maize, cloth, labor, or luxury goods, functioned as the economic bloodstream of Maya government. But in years of drought, tribute became nearly impossible to collect. Farmers, too busy surviving, could not produce excess food to give away. Craft specialists lacked materials for production. Even cities rich in trade saw their caravans disrupted by warfare. Without tribute revenue, kings could not pay their warriors, laborers, scribes, or stonemasons. Without paid supporters, their political structure became hollow. Diplomacy deteriorated as well. In earlier centuries, palace courts were centers of negotiation, where scribes recorded treaties, royal marriages, and trade agreements. But as warfare spread, diplomacy lost value. Alliances often collapsed within years or even months. There are inscriptions describing cities switching sides multiple times, betraying former allies, and attacking previous partners. These reversals show the instability of trust in the late Maya period. Kings no longer trusted one another to maintain agreements, and commoners no longer trusted kings to protect them from betrayal. The collapse of trade networks dramatically intensified political breakdown. Without jade, cacao, feathers, shells, and obsidian, kings lost the ability to display wealth and divine favor. Theaters of power, royal banquets, gift exchanges, public feasts became impossible. Palaces once decorated in exotic goods grew plain. The loss of economic glamour weakened the emotional and symbolic core of kingship. Religious transformation also damaged royal authority. As drought intensified and rituals failed to produce rain, people turned to local spiritual alternatives. Some villages revived ancient ancestor worship practices independent of kingship. Others prayed to local mountain spirits, cave guardians, and water gods rather than state-patronized deities. This decentralization of spiritual power represented a major ideological revolution. Maya kings were losing control of souls, not just cities. Without the belief that kings stood between humans and gods, the entire political structure lost meaning. Warfare made kingship even more fragile. Victories once confirmed divine power, but defeats ruined it. A king who lost a battle might be viewed as spiritually abandoned. His legitimacy could evaporate instantly. Captured kings rarely survived, and their deaths symbolized cosmic disgrace. In several sites, inscriptions record rulers being bound, humiliated, or displayed before execution. The emotional damage of such events spread across regions, discouraging loyalty to vulnerable dynasties. Urban abandonment became a visual symbol of royal failure. People walked away from cities they had inhabited for generations, leaving behind palaces, plazas, and temples. When a city emptied, so did the political identity attached to it. Kingship thrived on crowds witnessing greatness. Empty plazas killed its meaning. Some rulers tried relocating courts, following migrating populations, but these efforts rarely lasted. From the perspective of archaeology, this rapid return to nature paradoxically preserved the cities, without new construction or modern occupation disturbing them. Abandoned Maya sites remained largely untouched until rediscovery centuries later. Today, archaeologists uncover entire palace rooms sealed by collapse, rooms filled with pottery, tools, bones, pigments, and ritual objects that have lain undisturbed since the 9th century. One of the most compelling archaeological discoveries is that Maya cities show sudden abandonment, not slow demolition. In many places, cooking pots remain sitting on ancient hearthstones as if a household simply walked away during a meal. In Copán, archaeologists found wooden beams still resting inside royal halls, undisturbed since the day they fell. At Aguatica, obsidian blades and unfinished carvings lie across palace floors, suggesting that an attack forced residents to flee mid-work. Evidence like this contradicts the older myth that the Maya vanished. People did not vanish, they left. The buildings stayed behind. Excavation data also shows dramatic nutritional decline preceding collapse. Chemical analysis of skeletal remains from the late Classic and Terminal Classic periods reveals malnutrition, anemia, and bone lesions associated with chronic hunger. Earlier burials show healthy diets rich in maize, beans, cacao, and fruits. Later remains show nutritional stress and shorter average lifespans. Tooth enamel analysis indicates that childhood starvation became common during the last generations in the southern lowlands. These biological signatures demonstrate that collapse was not simply political drama. It was a human crisis that struck bodies as well as cities. Archaeologists have also discovered widespread fire damage. Many southern cities show layers of ash covering palace floors and temples. Without grand architecture and large-scale ceremony, kingship lost its stage. As power fractured, new governing strategies emerged. In some regions, councils replaced kings. Local elders governed villages instead of royal families. These experiments show that Maya civilization did not simply collapse. It transitioned toward different political forms. But these forms lacked the unifying ability that kingship once had. They operated locally, not regionally, eroding the interconnected identity that defined the classic Maya. Ultimately, the failure of kingship was not sudden. It was a gradual erosion of belief, wealth, and structural authority. The royal institution had been designed during times of abundance. When scarcity arrived, it could not adapt. The centralized system, dependent on food surpluses, artistic luxury, and monumental spectacle, crumbled under the weight of drought, hunger, and endless war. As warfare and political collapse reshaped the Maya world, the effects on ordinary people were profound and transformational. We often tell the story of the Maya fall through kings, wars, droughts, and monuments. But the true weight of collapse was carried by the millions of farmers, artisans, traders, and families whose daily lives changed forever. Their shift in behavior, beliefs, labor patterns, and population movement reflects a civilization trying desperately to adapt, even as its political structure fractured beyond repair. Understanding collapse from the perspective of the masses reveals why Maya abandonment was not merely a top-down event driven by failed kingship. It was a grassroots transformation created by ordinary choices. One of the most significant changes came from the breakdown of trust between rulers and commoners. For generations, Maya farmers accepted tribute demands, believing their labor supported a sacred system that guaranteed stability. But by the late 8th and 9th centuries, famine and insecurity led many to reevaluate their loyalties. When kings could not provide rain or defend farmlands from raiders, the social contract dissolved. Tribute laborers simply stopped appearing. Villages refused tax deliveries. Instead of rebellion through organized armies, collapse occurred through silent withdrawal. Families quietly packed belongings, walked away, and never returned. This type of abandonment leaves little written evidence but enormous archaeological footprints. Empty towns, unfinished houses, silent workshops, and unharvested fields. Agricultural disruption became catastrophic, with men drafted into warfare and others abandoning cities. Large terrace networks fell into ruin. Irrigation channels silted up, making fields useless. Without maintenance, hillside farming structures collapsed, triggering soil erosion that destroyed long-term productivity. In cities where thousands relied on imported food, shortages rapidly escalated into hunger. Malnutrition rates rose sharply, as shown by bone studies revealing stunted growth, anemia, and increased disease in late burials. The Maya collapse was not just political, it was biological. Bodies recorded the trauma long before temples fell silent. Social mobility changed dramatically. Previously, status was inherited. Noble families stayed noble, artisans remained artisans, and peasants stayed tied to farmland. But collapse destabilized hierarchy. In abandoned regions, status meant little. People survived through ability, not ancestry. Some elites, stripped of wealth and power, likely integrated into common society. Conversely, some former farmers assumed leadership roles in new villages, guiding migration or organizing defenses. Collapse created opportunity as well as loss. It reshaped identity into something more flexible, though less secure. Craft traditions suffered deeply. Without strong trade networks, specialized industries shut down. Jade carving disappeared from many regions, replaced by simple stone tools. Pottery styles became rougher and more utilitarian. Archaeologists noticed thinner ceramic walls, simpler pigments, and fewer decorations. These changes reveal more than declining aesthetics. They show a shrinking worldview. When people are hungry or threatened, artistic expression becomes secondary to survival. Workshops emptied, kills cooled, and once thriving artisan neighborhoods slowly died. Long-distance travel also became dangerous. Warfare on trade routes forced merchants to abandon safe passage between cities. Markets that once bustled with goods and information turned local, selling only what could be produced nearby. Isolation damaged cultural transfer. Ideas stopped circulating, languages diverged, and dialects split. A once connected world fell into regional fragmentation. Identity became local rather than civilizational. Religious life adapted to the new realities. With kingship weakening, many turned away from state-sponsored temples and focused on household spirituality. Archaeological remains show a rise in domestic shrines, small altars, and simple figurines placed inside homes. These objects indicate families turning inward, seeking protection from personal gods rather than distant rulers. Ritual practices also changed shape. With fewer large ceremonies, local festivals and ancestor worship became more important. Spirits of hills, caves, and rivers, once minor forces in the royal cult, became central deities for survival communities. At the same time, fear spread through the cultural imagination. Mythology adapted to mirror social anxiety. Legends describing underworld journeys, catastrophic endings, and cosmic imbalance gained prominence. Oral traditions likely carried tales of past cycles ending, reinforcing the idea that collapse was part of divine order. This spiritual reframing helped people emotionally navigate irreversible change. Urban abandonment reached astonishing levels. Major cities like Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Piedras Negras, Cancuin, Caracol, Dos Pilas, and hundreds of smaller centers began losing population at alarming rates. In some cases, tens of thousands departed within a generation. Entire ceremonial plazas, once the center of cultural life, grew silent. Temples that had seen hundreds of years of continuous worship became empty. Birds nested in abandoned palace roofs. Jaguars roamed across what had once been busy avenues. Imagining these scenes brings the emotional depth of collapse into focus. These were not ruined, lost cities in their own time. They were decaying memories visible to survivors who remembered their magnificence. Not all areas collapsed at the same time. Some regions remained strong for decades longer, especially cities located in wetter northern areas. But this uneven collapse created further instability. When southern cities failed, migrants flooded into northern territories, straining local resources and altering political balances. Northern elites viewed these migrants with suspicion and fear. Tensions between local populations and newcomers created conflict that spread destabilization northward. Collapse was contagious. Another consequence of warfare and political breakdown was the transformation of the Maya concept of power. Authority became fluid. Instead of long dynastic reigns, leadership rotated quickly. Some cities experimented with shared councils. Others fragmented into neighborhood-based rule. Such flexibility shows human resilience, but also reveals the loss of cohesion required to maintain a large-scale civilization. Without unified direction, cultural identity splintered, preventing coordinated recovery. Despite the devastation, it is important to note that Maya culture did not disappear. Language, art traditions, cosmology, agricultural skills, and trade knowledge continued, even as cities crumbled. Families preserved seeds, stories, songs, and weaving techniques. Collapse was not cultural death. It was political decentralization. The people endured, but the system that once united them did not. The abandonment of the great Maya cities stands as one of the most dramatic turning points in ancient world history. For centuries, towering Maya capitals like Tikal, Copan, Palenque, Caracol, Dos Pilas, Piedras Negras, and Yaxchilan defined the cultural heart of Mesoamerica. Yet by the late 8th and early 9th centuries, these magnificent cities began to empty. Royal courts dissolved, plazas fell silent, and monumental architecture ceased. This did not happen overnight. It unfolded through generations of neglect, migration, trauma, and cultural transformation. To understand this process, we must explore why people left their cities, how cities changed during abandonment, and what the archaeological record reveals about human decisions during the collapse. City abandonment can only be understood by recognizing the dense interdependence between rural land and urban life. Maya cities were not isolated stone monuments surrounded by untouched forest. They were living organisms built on massive networks of farms, reservoirs, and trade routes. When drought destroyed agricultural productivity, cities starved. When warfare disrupted trade, cities weakened. When dynastic rule collapsed, identity tied to royal lineage lost meaning. In such conditions, common sense, not just fear, pushed families to move elsewhere. People needed food, water, and safety more than monumental architecture or political loyalty. Abandonment was not failure, it was a survival decision. Archaeologists have identified numerous signs that rural depopulation preceded urban collapse. Farmers left outlying agricultural lands first, abandoning terraces and canals because they could not defend them from raids or weather cycles. Without farmers, cities lost their food supply. Without food, craftsmen, scribes, and nobles could not be sustained. As specialization broke down, entire economic branches collapsed. Pottery workshops closed, architects stopped producing building plans, and scribes left behind unfinished texts. The loss of these specialists signaled unraveling at the core of urban identity. Inscriptions from the late Classic era also stop abruptly in many regions, especially between 800 and 900 CE. This phenomenon, called the monument cessation, reflects both political and cultural silence. When rulers were no longer able to erect carved stelae proclaiming victories, marriages, and cosmic events, it meant kings lacked resources, scribes, laborers, or authority. Some stele complexes ended mid-sequence, with one final date marking the last breath of a dynasty. After that, silence. This archaeological silence reflects human silence, a world without stone storytellers. During the abandonment process, elite families often left first. This might seem surprising since elites typically had more resources, but elites depended heavily on political stability. Without tribute, their households could not operate. Many elites relocated to safer or wetter regions, taking knowledge, labor networks, and sacred objects with them. The departure of elite households removed leadership, accelerating collapse. Commoners left next, slowly at first, then en masse. Families probably migrated in small groups, carrying clay pots, weapons, grinding stones, and seeds. Archaeological evidence shows households carefully cleared floors before leaving, indicating planned migration rather than sudden flight. Tools were taken, valuables removed, and food stores emptied. These details show intention, not panic. People knew their cities were failing long before the last person walked away. Some abandoned structures were repurposed into temporary housing. Staircases show signs of makeshift hearth installations, meaning royal palaces may have been reused by ordinary families once elites left. This reveals a transitional phase. Cities were not instantly abandoned, but transformed into survival spaces. Over time, however, these occupied cores emptied as well. Urban soundscape changed dramatically. In earlier centuries, plazas had echoed with drums, children's voices, markets, music, ball game celebrations, and ritual chants. During abandonment, these sounds were replaced by wind in empty corridors, dripping water in unused reservoirs, bird calls echoing inside chambers, and the creak of collapsing roofs. The psychological impact of hearing an empty city must have been immense. For people who once saw their city as the center of the world, silence was a cultural death sentence. Cities left behind acted as time capsules. Archaeologists discovered grinding stones left beneath house floors, indicating families believed they would someday return. Caches of seeds and tools hint at hope. But seasons became years, and years became permanent departure. Forests crept back into plazas, roots cracked temple stairways, and vines swallowed murals painted only generations earlier. Nature reclaimed power. What had taken centuries to construct unraveled in decades. Abandonment also altered burial practices. In healthy cities, burial traditions followed strict patterns. Nobles under temples, commoners beneath homes, infants placed near hearths. But in late classic and terminal classic layers, burials became chaotic. Some bodies were interred hastily or placed outside traditional zones, showing a breakdown of ritual order. Others were buried with minimal offerings, reflecting economic scarcity. Still others appear to have been left unburied within collapsed buildings, suggesting catastrophic social disruption. Trade cities experienced especially rapid decline. Port towns, once bustling with merchants exchanging obsidian, salt, cacao, and jade, grew quiet as roads and rivers became unsafe. Caravan leadership disappeared, and trade carts sat unused. Inland cities lost access to coastal salt, an essential preservative, and communities lost access to food reserves. The collapse of salt trade alone may have accelerated abandonment through disease and malnutrition. Even sacred spaces lost protection. Temples were defaced, shrines emptied, and idols removed or smashed. Whether this was done by desperate survivors abandoning belief or by migrants establishing new rituals remains unclear. But the symbolic destruction reveals dramatic cultural transformation. The gods of earlier generations were no longer seen as reliable. City abandonment does not mean everyone died. Many Maya migrated north into Yucatan, where cities like Uxmal and Chichén Itzá flourished. Others moved to highland Guatemala, integrating into new polities that survived into the post-classic period. The Maya people continued, but the classic Maya city system did not. By 900 CE, the landscape that once glimmered with royal capitals had become a kingdom of ruins. Temples stood unfinished, palaces empty, and plazas silent. Forest canopy stretched over pyramids. The collapse phase had begun. The abandonment period of the Maya lowlands was not only defined by population movements, it was also characterized by the emotional trauma and cultural reorientation that accompanied the collapse of community identity. When people left their ancestral cities, they were not merely relocating. They were leaving behind sacred histories, burial sites, dynastic memories, and mythological landscapes that had shaped their spiritual worldview for generations. The Maya relationship with place had always been sacred. Cities were viewed as living beings connected to cosmic forces and ancestors. To walk away from a city was to step away from the heart of one's cultural universe. Exploring this emotional dimension reveals a deeper and more human side of collapse. The Maya did not vanish into the jungle. They carried grief, memory, and hope with them. One major driving force behind abandonment was the collapse of infrastructure. Maya cities depended on intricate engineering to survive the difficult rainforest environment. Aqueducts, reservoirs, raised roads, terraces, and water filtration systems allowed these great centers to thrive. But infrastructure required constant upkeep. When political unity dissolved and the labor force shrank, maintenance collapsed. Reservoir walls eroded, causing leaks and contamination. Ball courts and plazas cracked under shifting moisture. Stucco coatings flaked from temple facades as fresh plaster could no longer be produced. Even the great causeways connecting cities began disappearing beneath encroaching foliage. Without functioning infrastructure, urban life became physically unsustainable. The collapse of food distribution systems was equally devastating. Urban populations depended on complex agricultural logistics. Food had to be grown in distant fields, transported through organized channels, stored efficiently, and redistributed across neighborhoods. When warfare and drought disrupted these systems, famine spread. People living in cities could no longer rely on continuous supply. Storage pits emptied and were not refilled. Granaries sat barren. Public feasts that once reinforced social unity turned into sources of resentment as only elites continued receiving luxuries. Over time, hunger became a force more powerful than tradition. Even those deeply attached to their homes chose survival over loyalty. Urban abandonment also mirrored demographic change. Archaeologists studying burial sites have found significant shifts in age distribution near the end of classic Maya urban life. Fewer children survived past infancy. Adult lifespans shortened and nutritional deficiencies increased. These changes demonstrate that collapse was not just a cultural story, it was a biological one. As food scarcity worsened, childbirth rates likely declined. Families unable to support multiple children may have chosen migration to ensure their survival. In some regions, households disintegrated, with younger members leaving while older ones stayed behind, dying in near-deserted communities. The spiritual dimension of abandonment is equally important. Maya religion tied people to specific places. Mountains, springs, cenotes, caves, and even specific stones were believed to hold sacred power. When individuals migrated, they carried small symbolic objects with them: stone beads, figurines, ritual blades, and sacred seeds. These portable relics acted as containers of memory and identity. Meanwhile, larger temples and tombs were left unprotected. Without maintenance, religious spaces lost color, walls eroded, and murals faded. The decline of temple culture marked a psychological shift. Religion was no longer anchored in monumental public worship, but relocated into the home, the forest, and the private heart. The social rhythms of cities declined as well. Markets no longer buzzed with trade. Once vibrant plazas that hosted festivals, dances, and rituals turned into empty expanses. The Maya ballgame, more than sport, a theatrical symbol of cosmic conflict, lost ritual significance. Courts became silent stone rings, slowly filling with leaves and dust. The arts declined alongside these cultural spaces. Workshops that had produced fine ceramics, murals, jewelry, and carved bone objects saw their tools abandoned and walls unfinished. Burned beams, smoke-blackened walls, and collapsed roofs suggest violent destruction, perhaps from internal revolt, foreign invasion, or civil war. Yet not all ruins show fire. Some cities decayed quietly. The variety of abandonment patterns proves that collapse was not the result of a single event, but rather thousands of local stories stitched into one historical transformation. Monument inscriptions provide another essential form of evidence. Most Maya cities carved stone monuments to record significant events: coronations, wars, marriages, alliances, offerings, and astronomical cycles. These inscriptions form the timeline of Maya political history. But during the 9th century, inscriptions abruptly stop at many sites. At places like Tikal, Piedras Negras, and Copan, there are no written texts beyond certain dates. This silence is meaningful. It indicates loss of scribal training, reduction in elite resources, or the end of dynastic government itself. A civilization confident in its future writes its name into history. A civilization facing collapse falls silent. Archaeologists also use chemical and pollen analysis to reconstruct the environmental background of collapse. Sediment cores taken from lake bottoms around Maya regions show sudden changes in plant pollen during the collapse era. Maize pollen declines dramatically, replaced by grass and weed pollen, indicating abandoned fields. Charcoal layers increase, showing widespread burning of forest land, either for swidden agriculture or warfare destruction. The layers beneath the soil are silent histories revealing a world struggling to feed itself. Water systems provide even more physical evidence. Maya cities survived because of engineered reservoirs and canals. Yet archaeological surveys show that these structures fell into disrepair shortly before abandonment. Sediment filled reservoirs, walls cracked, and filtration systems clogged. Creativity demands stability. Collapse extinguished it like a flame deprived of oxygen. The breakdown of intellectual society also drove abandonment. Maya scribes, astronomers, and mathematicians once flourished in palace schools and priestly colleges. But as kingships fell, these scholars lost patronage. They had no one to support their work, no institutions to store their knowledge, and no social function to fulfill. With the collapse of monumental inscription, the intellectual heartbeat of Maya cities faded. Without recording history, the future became untethered from the past. Abandonment created cultural amnesia, not because people forgot, but because they no longer had the means to remember through writing. Trade decline compounded these effects. While some cities might have survived drought and isolation, few could thrive without imported resources. Salt, obsidian, jade, cacao, and coastal fish were essential elements of Maya urban identity. Once trade routes collapsed due to warfare and danger, urban economies failed. People left because there were simply no supplies left to sustain urban specialization. Without trade, cities became technological traps, places requiring skills no longer profitable. Childhood during abandonment would have transformed dramatically. Children born during late classic crises grew up surrounded by ruins rather than glory. Instead of watching temple construction, they saw scaffolding decay. Instead of attending public festivals, they learned to fear hunger, conflict, and uncertainty. A generation raised under collapse would naturally imagine its future not in the cities of its parents, but somewhere new, somewhere safer, wetter, or more sustainable. Abandonment was not only an adult decision, it was a generational shift. The abandonment episodes also varied regionally. In the southern lowlands, cities emptied rapidly and permanently. In contrast, cities in the northern Yucatan restructured, reusing ceremonial spaces to serve political newcomers. Chichén Itzá, Uxmal, and other northern sites benefited from southern migration. They experienced cultural fusion, an exchange of language, architecture, ideas, and traditions. This indicates that abandonment did not mean the end of Maya civilization. It meant the birth of a new regional identity. Meanwhile, remote farming villages sometimes persisted longer than major capitals. This suggests that collapse was most intense where social complexity was highest. Without political pressure, smaller communities adapted more easily, switching crops, moving fields, or sharing resources. This paints the Maya collapse not as total destruction, but as uneven decline shaped by geography and social structure. By the time major capitals were empty, the Maya had altered their understanding of civilization itself. They no longer believed that greatness required giant temples or powerful kings. Their worldview shifted toward local autonomy, smaller communities, simpler architecture, and more flexible political relationships. Abandonment was not just an ending, it was transformation at the deepest cultural level. To complete our understanding of how Maya cities emptied, we must examine how cultural identity shifted during abandonment. Not merely why people left, but how they emotionally and socially adapted to life outside monumental city centers. The Maya collapse is often misunderstood as a mysterious disappearance. Yet what truly happened was the gradual transformation of a complex urban civilization into smaller, more localized communities. These cultural shifts reveal a society that did not vanish, but reshaped its own existence under stress, adapting through migration, innovation, and memory preservation. The first major cultural shift occurred in the meaning of home. For hundreds of years, Maya families lived in houses clustered near temples, plazas, and palaces. Their homes were more than structures. They were spiritual places built atop ancestral ground. Each family compound carried generations of memories, births, marriages, burials, and rituals. But as drought conditions worsened and warfare intensified, the meaning of home changed. Home was no longer tied to sacred geography. It shifted to wherever survival was possible. A family carrying seeds, grinding stones, and clay pots could rebuild home anywhere. This redefinition of identity, from rooted to mobile, was the emotional core of abandonment. Migration reshaped kinship networks. When families traveled, they rarely traveled alone. Groups of related households moved together, strengthening ties within family lineages, but weakening ties to the larger state structure. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains and settlement patterns have found evidence of community clusters in new territories that mirror family names and kin structures from abandoned areas. This suggests that the Maya collapse produced a culture of clan migration, where identity shifted from city-based citizenship to lineage-based belonging. Religious practices reflected this change. Without access to grand temple complexes, people adapted their rituals to village settings. Portable altars replaced towering pyramids. Household shrines replaced public plazas. The gods themselves may have changed in worship style. Rather than honoring divine kingship and cosmic order, people relied on nature spirits, local ancestors, and more intimate deities connected to rain, fire, hearth, and field. This change did not mean religion weakened. In fact, it became more personal and immediate. Rituals that once involved thousands in plazas became deeply private, connecting individuals to the divine through direct experience rather than royal mediation. The shift away from monumental architecture affected artistic style as well. Art became simpler. Fortified neighborhoods, watchtowers, and sac-biab required continuous maintenance and manpower, while military mobilization diverted labor from agriculture, artisan production, and ritual construction. Repeated raids, sieges, or inter-city competition likely contributed to social unrest and population displacement. While warfare had previously reinforced elite authority and social cohesion, in times of economic and environmental stress, it became a destabilizing force. Ritual and religious life also underwent transformation during periods of decline. Ceremonial observances, ball games, and sacrificial rituals had long served to reinforce political legitimacy and communal cohesion. As social stress increased, participation in ritual life may have become inconsistent, and the capacity of elites to sanction ceremonial authority may have been diminished. Household and neighborhood rituals likely persisted, preserving cultural memory at the local level, but the scale and frequency of citywide ceremonies may have decreased. Religious adaptation, syncretism, and local innovation helped maintain spiritual continuity even as centralized ritual authority waned. Despite these challenges, Northern Postclassic Maya cities left a lasting legacy. Architectural innovations, such as Puke-style masonry, colonnaded halls, pyramids, and ceremonial plazas, influenced subsequent construction and provided a template for urban planning. Artistic and craft traditions, including pottery, textiles, murals, and stone carving, were transmitted to later communities and continue to inform Mesoamerican visual culture. Knowledge systems, particularly astronomy, mathematics, calendrics, and ritual practice, were preserved in codices, inscriptions, and oral traditions, ensuring continuity of intellectual heritage. The synthesis of Southern and Northern innovations that characterized post-classic culture became a defining feature of Maya identity for centuries to follow.